On today's Locked On Jayhawks, what is the worry scale for the KU football program? That and a little more Zeke Mayo.
You are Locked On Jayhawks, your daily podcast on the Kansas Jayhawks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
I'm Derek Johnson. You can find me on Twitter at DJohnsonRadio. He's Nick Schwert at Nick_Schwert. And we're going to be going over the worry scale on today's episode. A little more KU basketball. Zeke Mayo, whose stat line is it anyway? Thank you for making Locked On Jayhawks your first listen every day. Thank you to the everydayers catching each and every show. Free and available anywhere you get your podcasts. Also find us on the YouTube page where you can like and subscribe. And today's episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. Place your first $5 bet and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed. Again, that is FanDuel.com to get started today. Okay, so Nick, we're going to be going over some worry scale stuff. So I'm just going to give you a general topic, a couple words, a name, and you tell me if there's a worry scale from 1 to 10 of what level should we be worried about these things. So first things first, Jalon Daniels.
How worried should we be about him and his play? How worried should we be that he's going to be the starting quarterback? Like, what exactly would you like me to dissect here? But it doesn't really matter. The answer is probably going to be the same regardless. Given the current circumstances of who his play caller is and what he's looked like through the first 5 weeks, the worry scale is a 10, I guess. But what are we worried about? Because the season's over, Derek, right? Like, they're 1-4. Whatever your goals were for the beginning of the season, they're going to fall short of those. So it's a 10, but if you're willing to be a little nihilistic with me and just accept defeat on the season, then from that perspective, what is there to worry about? Maybe it's a 0 or somewhere in between. How's that for an answer?
Yeah, I see what you're saying in that, like, well, if you're just setting things up for next year, but we don't know, like, is Jalon Daniels going to be part of the 2025 Kansas team? I think everybody you would ask coming into this year who's kind of in the know is kind of the assumption that this was going to be his final season at Kansas, that he was going to try to ball out, go off to the NFL. So what does this all mean? What does the NIL stuff mean? Like, is he going to wind up transferring to another program? Is he going to be back in another school? And if he is going to be back for 2025 at Kansas, because he does have another year left, what you just said starts to change a little bit because, like you said, you're not going to accomplish what your goals were this season. But if now we're viewing it from a lens of whatever Jalon Daniels does the rest of this season sets him up for possibly being the starter or doing this or that in 2025, then all of a sudden the conversation becomes a little bit different as well. I wouldn't quite go 10 on your first side of it just because of the factor of there still is in the back of my head the idea that, like, well, how much of this is just Jeff Grimes? And, like, what happens if you do make a change at offensive coordinator, which doesn't seem to be happening, and I'm not necessarily expecting to happen because Lance Leipold is a very patient guy, a very loyal guy in a lot of ways, which I think for the most part can be a good thing. In this case, might not be the best thing in the world. But yeah, I think with Jalon, certainly the worry scale is up there. And, like, each and every week, it feels like you might psych yourself up on Saturday morning. Like, okay, maybe today's the day that we see the Jalon of old. And eventually just the hope meter drops down.
Well, at this point, even if your hope is still high, it's a little late for the Jalon of old to rear his head and appear again. Like, too little, too late, right? Like, yes, you could still show up and maybe KU goes on some sort of a run, goes to a bowl game, and, you know, we look back on this. But you're right. Like, I thought that was going to happen after the 2 straight losses. And then I thought it was going to happen after the West Virginia game. I think I've run out of hope. I think I have exhausted my hope meter for the season in 4 consecutive weeks. It does not replenish itself that quickly.
Okay, so Jeff Grimes, if I were to say that as a name on the worry scale, I think it would probably be another 9 or 10 on the list. So instead of viewing that, what I just touched on, the worry scale that Jeff Grimes will still be the offensive coordinator come 2025.
2025?
Yes, to start next year.
I am not worried about that. I do not think that is going to happen. I keep waking up every Monday for the last month expecting to hear some sort of announcement that he is either going to be demoted or that Zabrowski is going to be promoted to co-offensive coordinator. Right? I don't expect him to just be outright fired this season, but I would be pretty shocked. I agree with you. Lance Leipold's patient, but he was patient with a really good offensive coordinator. And Andy Kotelnicki, it's not, I don't know. I guess we could go back and look at what he was doing.
Yeah, there were like past articles that in year 2 of Kotelnicki, they were 2-10. I think they averaged like 15 points per game. And there were articles talking about he should be let go. And he wasn't. That was year 2.
And it's different now when you're at Kansas and you were expected to be really good this season. So having a bad year as an offensive coordinator doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? Circumstances matter and who you replacing matters. Like you're replacing a really good OC and people expected you to kind of pick up where he left off and you haven't come close to that.
Yeah, that's where it is. Like if Kansas would have graduated all their good players from last year's team, it would be a little bit more understandable. The fact that it's like the same guys that just really did well the last couple of years kind of changes things a little bit there. A quick side rant that I did want to bring up because I saw this quote the other day from Jeff Grimes just to echo how dumb I think this whole thing is. He was talking about getting Quentin Skinner and LJ Arnold, trying to get them going. And he said that there were a lot of factors that dictate how they can play. He said the play call, what the defense does, protection, quarterback. First of all, I hate it when this happens, like with quotes from coaches that's acting like, hey, you know, I don't think you would understand the reality of this. Like us, you plebes, you regular people, you wouldn't understand it. It's very hard. It's very complicated. So I'm going to dumb down the answer a little bit here. Meanwhile, you know what the best coaches do on the offensive side of the ball? You know what defines good offensive coaches? It's finding ways to get your best players the football. It is finding ways to get your best players the ball. Do you think Kyle Shanahan, like after an NFL game, like it's like, oh no, I only gave Christian McCaffrey the ball 4 times. What am I doing? What am I doing? Like if only the defense, you know, I thought the defense was going to expect run every player. Like Andy Reid's like, you know what? We decided to only have Patrick Mahomes throw the ball 8 times today because the defense thought he was going to pass. So we didn't want to do that. You know, it's like figure out a way to get your good players the ball.
I would take it a step further. I think the best offensive minds, like one you just mentioned, Kyle Shanahan and Andy Kotelnicki, like KU had last year, is they don't just find ways to get their best players the ball. They say, how can I get guys that nobody's expecting to get the ball in space to make plays? Like Kyle Shanahan is one of the few coaches in the NFL who's getting touches for his fullback and Kyle Juszczyk. Andy Kotelnicki was running these weird misdirection plays that would end up with Jared Casey ripping off a 20-yard reception. Jared Casey's been non-existent this year in the offense. So that's kind of, it's twofold. You're right. It's about finding ways to get your best players the ball, but it's also making life easy for everyone so that defenses don't know what is coming. It's innovation. It's creativity. And this offense right now with Jeff Grimes is lacking all of that.
Which are you more worried about? Attendance for the rest of the season, the recruiting class for the class of 2025 for football, or the building of the stadium?
What am I most worried about? I would say if I'm ranking them, stadium 1, recruiting class 2, attendance 3. I think you were already kind of had the card stacked against you a little bit coming into the season, like playing these games at Arrowhead. You're never going to fill that thing up unless you're undefeated and it's the end of the season and you got a top 25 matchup against Colorado, right? That was really the only way you were going to do that. That's over. Like go back to the tweet that Lance Leipold's wife may or may not have sent about fan support. And that's been a theme really for the last couple of years. Travis Goff, Lance Leipold basically pleading with Kansas fans. They thought that 2 good seasons was enough to get, record turnout for Memorial Stadium. And now you don't get to do that at all. You don't get to play that card. And if you thought it was bad before, just wait to see what it's going to look like now. These last, 3 games at Arrowhead. Recruiting class is always going to be an issue, just considering how much you're losing this year. And granted, like I had this exercise on our show earlier this week. I don't want to get too much off topic here, but who's the best player on the roster that Lance Leipold and his staff brought on? Like this core is all guys that were here before this staff got here. Whether it's your two cornerbacks, your running back, your quarterback, all your wide receivers were leftovers from the previous regime, and you're going to see so much turnover. Not that recruiting class would necessarily make a huge impact next year, but Lance Leipold's calling card, program builder, right? He has built him up over the last 3 years, granted, using players that were left over. You can't let this thing snowball out of control to the point where kids start looking at this program and saying, yeah, same old Kansas. Yeah, nice little run, but I'm not going to go waste away like so many guys have over the last 10 to 15 years. But the stadium's the big one, man. The stadium is huge. That is the future of this program. I joked a couple of weeks ago that, they're going to end up with half a stadium. They're going to end up with that new west side in the bowl, and that east side is going to stay there because the funding is going to dry up. Donors are going to be mad that they were pressed for money to get this thing built, and now the results are not following on the field. So that is a major, major concern. I hope that can be fixed with some late season wins, but would it shock you if there were donors who feel like KU's not really holding up their end of the bargain and feeling like maybe they were sold a false bill of goods with this fundraising?
Well, I think that's something that probably is going to go around the country when teams start not doing well. It's tenfold for Kansas because for a lot of these other schools, I think it's going to come from an NIL perspective. I think for Kansas, it is tenfold because you have the stadium and NIL. Eventually, some of these boosters are going to get tapped out, and they're going to start saying, hey, especially when you have a bad season. It's one thing you keep climbing up the rankings, you keep doing all these things. It's another when you had a bad year. Some guys are still going to be committed to it. Some guys are even going to go further with it and say, okay, well, I need to do even more. But I think a lot of people are going to say, okay, you keep coming back to me. I only have so much money, So I think that'll all be interesting in how that kind of unfolds. All right, little KU basketball talk. Bill Self reiterated some interesting stuff on Zeke Mayo. Also some interesting comments on AJ Storr. We'll get to that next. This episode of Locked On Jayhawks is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook. Hey, NFL fans, you can start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So when you get a hunch in the middle of the game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. You'll get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. You can get in action for the Kansas-Arizona State game coming up this weekend. You can get in action for Kansas basketball preseason ahead of the year to win the national title, or Hunter Dickinson to win National Player of the Year. You can get in action on the Chiefs favored against the Saints on Monday Night Football. That's at FanDuel.com. FanDuel.com, the official sportsbook partner of the Locked On Podcast Network. All right, we're back on Locked On Jayhawks and talking a little bit about KU basketball here. So we had an episode earlier in the week, and it was interesting. Bill Self went on another podcast and now reiterated some of the stuff he said about Zeke Mayo. And the first time we talked about it, we were kind of like, well, what's the full context here? We weren't entirely sure. Now, what was the motivation? Was it true? Now that he said it twice, I feel like it is kind of true. So what are we talking about here? If Zeke Mayo is in fact, has been their most impressive player over the last 2 or 3 months of camp, what does that look like here? What does the season look like for Zeke Mayo?
Well, I think, coming into the season with the transfer portal movement and all the quote unquote big names you brought in, one of the biggest questions was what's this going to look like in terms of style? Because there were a lot of different ways you could go. You could play with DeJuan and then just roll a bunch of wings out there. You could play two bigs if you want to consider KJ a big. And with Zeke, it's, do you play two guards? And, we've talked so many times about how much Bill likes playing with two ball handlers. And aside from Zeke, let's just boil this down to the guys who we actually think are going to be in that core rotation. Zeke's the only other guy besides DeJuan who would qualify as a secondary ball handler. So that's one part of it. Maybe Bill is just falling in love with the idea again of saying, hey, DeJuan doesn't need to be the only guy who's initiating offense. Let's get another guy who can play with the ball in his hands. He can play off ball. He can shoot, etc. I do wonder, though, is there maybe an ulterior motive? Because it seems like the guy who in this scenario is the odd man out is Rylan Griffin. And when we go back over the years of guys who fans were maybe excited about and then didn't end up playing as much, the common denominator is oh, you just came here and wanted to shoot. Like, you came here, you wanted to shoot 6 threes a game, and that was about it. And that's obviously never going to fly. Zeke being a local kid, like, this is his dream to play at Kansas. It's not just the best offer that was out there, right? It's, fulfilling a lifetime dream. Wouldn't shock me if he's the guy doing all the right things, saying all the right things, paying close attention to what the coaches want of him, and trying to just be a team player, be the guy that's just doing all the little stuff. That's going to get you a long ways. And if you have the skill to go with it, it doesn't shock me all that much. Now, I don't really know what this means for Zeke, like in terms of production. He's not going to be your leading scorer. I don't think he's going to be your second leading scorer. And where does that leave you? Maybe around 10 to 12 points per game if you're the third leading scorer. But for a guy who spent the last 4 years playing at South Dakota State, that would be a pretty cool story. And he's a shooter. He's a ball handler. Like, those are things that KU needs. So it does make sense in terms of like him filling a role that KU was missing last year.
You bring up a good point with Ryland Griffin, and think about it this way too. Like, if you're Ryland Griffin, you're coming off the Final Four season. Kansas was the team that lost in the second round. Like, you're coming in going on the stuff, right? And then think about it too from the standpoint of, it's not just, like you said, guys who just shoot threes. You played for Nate Oates. Every three was a good three. And with Bill Self, it's not just that he's going to get upset if you're just launching threes. If you're taking bad threes, he's going to get into you. So I still think Ryland Griffin will be good, and I do think he has more athleticism and more to him than some of those previous guys. Like, if we're comparing to Nick Timberlake, I don't even think it's night and day. Also, he has 2 years. But, yeah, I do think that's interesting. I also thought it was interesting you mentioned the motivation. I thought this is where you were going to go with it. When he listed the 4 starters, he said DeJuan, he said Hunt, he said Zeke Mayo. Now, there was a little bit of a what color is the dress situation, with some people saying, did he say AJ or did he say KJ as the 4th guy? I thought he said KJ as that 4th guy, but I don't know. Maybe he did say AJ, and then that would leave open a different discussion, different can of worms with KJ Adams. But I think we assume it was KJ, and that would mean he's not saying that for AJ Storr. And he went into other areas in that podcast about AJ Storr, saying that, I think he needs to be the best offensive rebounder in the country. I think he can be a good defender, all these sorts of things. The motivation with AJ Storr feels like, to me, that he thinks AJ Storr can be like an absolute dude, and he's trying to get that out of him.
Well, yeah. I mean, him saying a guy who might be one of the best pure scorers in the country and saying he should lead the nation in offensive rebounding. AJ Storr hearing that's going, excuse me? Sorry, coach, I didn't come here to rebound the ball. I came here to shoot and score 20 a night. I am assuming, based off of not just his statistical profile, but his lengthy track record of being a guy who just wants to get up shots, he's probably not too interested in doing all the little things. And a lesser man, a less intelligent version of myself, me 5 years ago, would have said, listen, this is all window dressing. There is no way that Bill Self would bring AJ Storr, the number 1 transfer in the country, off the bench. I think we've seen now, it doesn't matter who you were, what your number was. I'm not predicting it. I'm just saying we can't sit here after the whole Remy Martin fiasco and act shocked if a transfer from a different program with bad habits comes in and immediately finds himself in Bill Self's doghouse, right? We have to at least entertain the idea that for that first game of the season, AJ Storr is your 6th man, and then all of a sudden we start to get inklings that, he's not exactly doing everything the coaches want from him right now.
Okay. Wow. I did not think we were going to go there.
Is that a hot
It's an interesting point. I think it's a fun one. I think it's interesting, and I think you run into the issue, though, where it's if AJ Storr's not starting, who is, Yeah,
no, then listen, I'm not predicting. I think AJ Storr will be a starter. I'm just saying, if you asked me,
it's not a given.
An open-ended hypothetical, most likely to wind up in Bill Self's doghouse, there's my answer.
Okay, I like that one. Maybe we'll do some superlatives like that later up on another edition of Locked On Jayhawks. We got to finish up here, though. Whose stat line is it anyway? Next. This is Locked On Jayhawks. Thanks for making us your first listen every day. You can check out Locked On College Football or want to check out the Arizona State side of things, we had a crossover episode as well. So check those out with our Locked On Podcast Network. All right, our whose stat line is it anyway for this week comes from KU football. And here's the question for today. How many times has a Kansas quarterback led the Big 12 in interceptions? The Big 12 goes back to what, like 96, I believe.
Okay. Wow. So that gives me almost 30 seasons. Let's call it 27 seasons of football. If you're bringing this up, there's no way it's just like 3, because that's not interesting. So I'm gonna go with 9 times. 9 times the Kansas quarterback has led the Big 12 in interceptions.
So here's the problem. If you looked at it from a team ranking, I don't know. I'd have to go back and look. It probably was something high like that.
Too many guys getting benched mid-season.
It's only one. It's only one guy. And it's not even a guy you would expect.
Is it Todd Reesing?
No, that could be a good one from one of his later years. But no, actually the answer is Carter Stanley, but it's not even like one of the Carter Stanley years where it's like he was getting plucked in and out with Peyton Bender. It was Carter Stanley's final season, which like objectively was a good year for Kansas quarterbacks.
But that's the problem, is there was about an 8-year stretch where nobody started all season. Mm-hmm. Everybody would get benched, and then maybe a third guy would come in. So everyone would just end up with like 7 interceptions in 5 games.
Yeah. But yeah, that was actually a good season for a KU quarterback. But nonetheless, the second guy to do it right now, if the season ended, would be Jalon Daniels.
Which is weird because he's never been a turnover guy. But again, like, it just speaks to, we can sit here and go back and forth forever on like whose fault this is. Is Jalen rusty? Does he not know the playbook? Is it Jeff Grimes? It's a bad pairing. These two do not mix. They do not go well together. They are a bad duo. They are like Nelly and Tim McGraw. Individually, they have had success. But for whatever reason, when you put them on the same song together, I don't like it. And that's how it is with Jeff. Like, Jeff Grimes could leave and go have success somewhere else next year. Jalon Daniels could transfer and go have a great, final 6th year or whatever it is for him. But together, they do not mesh. It is oil and water, and we don't have any indication that it's like getting better. I guess you could say the last 2 games have been a little better for Jalon, but not enough. It's not enough. And maybe we're judging them off of the failures of those first 3 losses, but it's looking pretty bleak right now.
He's Nick Schwert at Nick_Schwert on Twitter. I'm Derek Johnson at D Johnson Radio. I don't know for this episode of Locked On Jayhawks. Nick, where can you check out some of your work? What's going on right now?
You can check out every episode of the Could Be Wrong podcast on YouTube, as well as anywhere you get your podcast.
All right. We'll see you next time with Locked On Jayhawks. Check out our crossover episode with Arizona State. We'll be back on Friday for KU ASU preview. See you then.